get started. So my name is Marco, and today we're going to be talking about how to deliberately teach the company way as you scale your teams, and aka the tech enablement overview. Just as a way of a little bit of a background, we also help start and run a community called Technicon that started a few years back in 2018 as an annual conference. And the idea, the insight was that there are a lot of people like us, and when I say us, I mean people responsible for leadership and development for technical folks. And there wasn't really a place for us to get together, to exchange ideas, to compare notes, to learn from one another. So we started the conference, and when I say we, it was my peers at the time from LinkedIn and Salesforce, and I was at Twitter. And so we started this at LinkedIn in 2018, full day event. 2019, we moved it to Twitter, and then 2020, as pandemic hit, we moved it to Zoom so that it was online, and we were basically meeting, or are now meeting every month as part of our roundtable series. So a lot of talks that you're going to hear about today, or insights, came from this community and your peers sharing their stories and their experiences. So with that, what do we mean by tech enablement? Well, we noticed that there's a set of practices that companies do to get their people up to speed, to enable them to deliver on the promise of them doing their best work. And those things include onboarding, so getting them going. They also include things like general knowledge sharing, learning from one another through collaborative and peer learning, mentorship, coaching, office hours, and documentation, and then ultimately collecting the metrics and figuring out what works, what doesn't. So that's what we mean by technical enablement. So the challenge that we observed is that in the beginning, when a company is small, this is not an issue. Everyone's sitting around the same table. The number of humans, experts within the walls is relatively known. So it's relatively easy to ad hoc figure out who knows what and connect with one another. As your team grows, as your organization grows, this is no longer so. You suddenly get more nodes, and connection between those nodes grows quadratically. So, right, so the more people, the harder it is to figure out who knows what. Some companies solve this by keeping the teams siloed. So each team is on their own, mimicking then a smaller organization. But then what you lose is organizational nimbleness. So you basically create an organization that's very siloed by its nature. So ultimately, what we want is high-performing teams, and we want to be able to maintain that at scale. So in other words, as we grow, as we add more people, we'll be able to also maintain that effectiveness, not just not lose it as the company grows. So as we go through this talk, I'll be pointing out a number of stories. And again, these stories came from your peers as part of the Technicon roundtables usually. And all these stories have links. So, and we have articles and often videos of each one of those talks. Once I finish this, I will be following up with you via email, and I'll provide this PDF. And as part of that PDF, you will have links to all the articles that I'm mentioning here. So you don't need to worry about remembering anything. You don't need to worry about, looking up the URLs. For now, just enjoy the story, and then I'll share this right afterwards. So, and just to kind of illustrate what that looks like. So if I click on this full story, that would open up the article. In this case, it's Alex Rudder from Twitter. He was an SVP, and this is his experience of growing Twitter engineering as the company went public. So, like I said, for every one of them, we're going to have the article. So with that, so Twitter, I was personally there, and I got to experience it firsthand. So essentially, as we were growing, we were adding people. We noticed that by adding people, we're not necessarily maintaining the productivity. In other words, more people was not necessarily a better results. So, and this was one of the biggest challenges for engineering leaders, right? So you get headcount, you double your team, but if you don't double productivity or get close to that, you have a hard time explaining what's going on. So Twitter had that problem, and basically we identified knowledge sharing as the key root cause of the issue in that particular case. We solved the problem by building Twitter University. So a lot of things that I'll talk about is also my firsthand experience because I ran that project and helped create it. So Facebook, at about the same time, although much smaller, had noticed a similar problem. So Wayne Chang was an engineering leader at Facebook at about 300 engineers. So very, very tiny company at the time. And very early on, they used to have a motto, run fast and break things. So it was all about just hacking and going fast and making things happen. But as they were adding engineers, they noticed that that's not going to scale. That's not going to fly. They need to do something different. They need to approach things differently. And so he set out to create their engineering bootcamp. And arguably, that's probably one of the most respected boot camps still to date, and they do things very differently. So they essentially keep the new hire as part of the onboarding process for many weeks, often 4 to 6 weeks. And during that time, the hiring manager does not even get access to the person. So basically, the person is part of the onboarding pod, and that pod is very interesting because they get to see all parts of Facebook. So the new hire is not assigned to a team, is assigned to engineering and gets to see various parts of engineering, from mobile to data science to backend to operations, etc. And that informs them of how Facebook holistically works. All that happens before they go to their micro team and get assigned to a specific point and specific team. So this is something that's unique in the industry. A lot of us don't get to hire into organization. We usually hire into a team, and that was something that was unique and different at Facebook. So I mentioned a couple of stories just to, as an appetizer, give you an idea that this is a thing that happens both at small companies and large. But with that, I wanted to jump into something we call Tech Enablement Maturity Index, or TEMI. And TEMI is a way to quickly assess where you stand in this journey of technical enablement. So it's not 0 or 1, it's not binary, right? You have basically layers of enabling your people, and some of us do certain aspects and some of us don't. So one prism, one way to look at this is through these 5 levels. So level 1 is sink or swim. Level 2 is you have somebody raising their hand and saying, I'll do something about this. Level 3 is partial ownership, and then it goes into complete ownership and well-funded team. So we're going to talk about these 5 levels, and I'll dive into each one separately, and you'll see how they differ. The key difference is usually about the level of investment, and through that, the level of importance and sort of awareness of what enablement does to an engineering team. All right, so level 1, you're basically not doing anything. Like, new hire comes in, you give them a laptop and you just hope for the best. There's very, very little going on. This is okay in a small company. There's not a lot of internal knowledge. There's not a lot of experts. So connecting the dots for a reasonably smart person, relatively straightforward. The challenge is once you have an established organization with a lot of internal intricacies and a lot of humans that you may not know who does what and how. So we've observed this firsthand. We did a project for WeWork. So this is WeWork as they were rapidly growing. They were doubling their engineering from 800 to 1,600 engineers. And they literally had, the only onboarding was, here's your brand new MacBook Pro and good luck, right? And so now it was up to you to figure out, wait, what's my code base? How do I check it out? How do I get provision? What is my username and password for GitHub, et cetera, et cetera. So it was very, very complex, confusing. And even though they hired very smart engineers, they provided no support for them to get up to competency quickly. I observed also this at GitHub. GitHub was more of that a large organization with a lot of siloed team. In other words, every team was an island on its own. And so every team resembled a small company. So as such, the onboarding was really up to a manager. That works fine, except with a couple of things. It was very uneven. So every manager there did their own thing. Some were great at onboarding new hires, some not so, right? So that was challenge one. Challenge two is when you have siloed teams, you have an organization that is not very nimble. So in other words, things work great until you need to reorg, and the mobile team has no idea how the backend team works or how observability, analytics, data teams work, et cetera, et cetera. So that becomes a challenge at a company like that. So this is level one. Level two is what we call a hero volunteer. So somebody had enough. They just basically noticed this is kind of annoying. We need to do something about that. And they raised their hand and they stepped up and did something. Often that person, this is not their job. They're just basically doing it because they see the pain. I noticed that I observed this firsthand at Twitter. Prior to Twitter University, which was fully funded, we had something called Flight School. So the idea behind Flight School was to ad hoc get new hires up to speed. It was started by a gentleman called Ryan King, and he basically created a band of old-timers, and they would just do this as volunteers. They would host workshops, and he would do some lightweight scheduling and get people onboarded onto how Twitter works and how we work at Twitter. Carbon Health had a very similar experience. They were growing quite rapidly, and we'll talk about their story in a bit. But they scaled quite rapidly, and they also had an engineer stand up, and so she took on owning, doing something about this. Level three is partial ownership. So for the first time, the leadership notices, this is a thing and we need to do something about that. So usually the way it pans out is that they assign someone to part-time on it. That someone usually is a TPM or a PM or program manager or somebody like that that is in engineering organization, but is juggling a lot of different balls, right? And so this is how it started at Carbon Health, and then they ended up funding it. We've observed this at Carta and some other tech companies as well. Complete ownership means you simply notice that this is a thing and you assign somebody full-time. So this is the first time that there's a full-time ownership of enablement. So technical enablement is now owned by somebody completely. And we've seen this play out well at Spotify. I mentioned Twitter earlier as well. Kia Motors, similar thing. We've seen Cruise do this, and Credit Karma did a great job with this as well for a smaller company. And then at some scale, and usually this has to do with scale, whereas the previous steps didn't necessarily have to do with scale, but at some scale, it's not just owned by a person, it's owned by a team. So we often feature Microsoft in technical community, and Microsoft onboards 1,000 engineers per month on a regular month. So that's a huge number of engineers. I believe they have over 100,000 at this point, even with layoffs. Salesforce is very similar, although somewhat smaller. Netflix has an entire team and a checklist and a lot of sort of processes of how they onboard. And then obviously Twitter University, which I'm speaking from my own experience about. So with that, we're going to jump into some of the building blocks. How does technical enablement work? How do you go about that? What are some of the practices? How do you actually implement it in your organization? So if you wanted to move to certain levels of maturity from 1 to 5, or you suddenly inherited it, so level 3 to 5, for example, what's the playbook? How do you do this? So one way to think about it is, what are all the things that need to happen between somebody coming in with basic knowledge, so like you hired a great engineer, to them being fully enabled? Well, a couple of things that we need to first define. What does fully enabled mean? And to us, that usually means they know how we work and they know how our stack works. here. So in other words, if they have basic technical skills, vanilla skills from the outside of the building, and we give them the right skills about how we work inside of the building, they should be up and running and productive. I'm using new hires here as an example, but the same thing is true for enabling people from one point in their career to the next. So it could be that you have an engineer that wants to become a staff engineer, or it could be that you have a backend engineer becoming a mobile engineer, or it could be that you have a manager or engineer that wants to become a manager, and so on. So these are all pathways of moving from one point in a career to the next. So for this person, there are a couple of things that happen to them. One is this some kind of codified knowledge that we get to dump at them. So maybe they didn't know how we build services here. We give them the instructions how to build services, and now they know. Now, just reading through knowledge, codified knowledge, or wiki pages, documents, etc., doesn't mean that they fully embrace it. So what needs to happen often is they need to practice it. They need to have the hands-on experience, try it out, and so on. And just trying it out and doing it doesn't mean that they embody it. So once they get to their day-to-day and start actually using this in their job, they can also get stuck. And so how do they get unstuck? What is the support for them? And so there are different aspects of this, how we support them. So for codified knowledge, it could be a self-paced, it could be instructor-led. For practice, it could be a cohort-based workshops. It could be code labs or something that is more hands-on. For support, it could be office hours, it could be mentorship and coaching, and so on. Now, as you run this program, for example, onboarding or up-leveling internally, you as a program manager, presumably, officially or unofficially, also want to be able to assess and survey how things are going so that you can close the loop and see what needs to be, what to lean in and what to fix. And you also want to create insights so that you can then use that to either empower their own managers to get involved, or even sell up to the leadership what is that you're doing and why it matters within your company. So those are some boxes or things to consider on this journey of just being a great expert to being a great expert internally in a company. So with that, let's talk about onboarding. So onboarding is often a low-hanging fruit. So as people come in, they need to get onboarded. And I'm going to just kind of point out some of these stories as we keep on going through this. So you should be seeing my screen. So I'll switch to the mode where you can see it like this. I'll mention a couple of stories to help you illustrate this. So, maybe this story is not, maybe this is not going to work. For some reason, some of these links may need to be fixed. Uber, for example, was onboarding people globally. What they noticed is that not every team globally is the same. So they wanted to create a onboarding that has aspects of the mothership. So this is how we do things at Uber, right? But they also wanted to give local autonomy to teams so that the Boston team and the Bangalore team, for example, can have some differences as well. So they kind of navigated this. How do we onboard engineers yet give autonomy to regions, because that's just the nature of their business. So that was Uber. I mentioned Carbon Health a few times. So Carbon Health was a smaller company, so not to the scale of Uber, but they were rapidly growing. So on the onset of the pandemic, they suddenly became a major player. And at the time they had 5 engineers, they grew to 90 engineers in something like 7 months. So that was a quite rapid growth. And they went through all 5 stages of maturity index timing. So they had nothing done initially, then they had one engineer, Hannah, she raised her hand and basically said, "I'm gonna own this." So that was the hero volunteer, and then she hired a program manager that helped her, and then that kind of evolved and so on. So that was the story of Carbon Health. And we also published some of the best practices of how we see companies do this. Well, this was for 2022. Again, I'll share this afterwards, so you will have links to all these articles, and you can see all the practices there. So that was onboarding, and that's usually the lowest hanging fruit and the easiest thing to do. And so this was, we mentioned Carbon Health, LinkedIn, Uber, and we also talked about globally how things are happening. Next up, we're going to talk about peer or collaborative learning. So I mentioned some of these stories already, and usually the idea behind this is that the smartest people are right in the building, and the question is, how do we enable that knowledge sharing so that, and not just knowledge sharing that's written down, but knowledge sharing that's tacit. So in other words, lives in people's heads. How do we enable that knowledge sharing across the population, internal people, right? And so I happened to run this at Twitter. We helped build Twitter University, and we heavily leaned on peer learning. So that was the big item that worked for us. And this is our story, how we did that, and what worked, what didn't. But essentially, the insight was that people love to share. We just need to make it super easy for them, and to lean in on short live sessions, because the preparation for that, the ask for that, is the lowest. So that's kind of how we did that at Twitter. Oops. Spotify did something very similar. So years later, we ran into their story, and it just happens that they came up with a very similar approach. They call it collaborative learning, and they did it for the purposes of unleashing innovation. So they basically said, you know what, like if we have two teams talk to one another, we're just going to have serendipity, and magic is going to happen, and new things are going to evolve. So that was their focus. So it was all about collaborative learning for them. Netflix, one of our favorite examples as well. In this case, Netflix Studios, to be precise. We work with the entire Netflix company, so from engineering to studio people and HR and so on. Studio is responsible for making the miniseries, and they have a tool chain of about a dozen homegrown tools. So you know, things that you use, from recording the miniseries to cataloging to preparing it. I don't fully understand all the aspects of what goes into making a movie, but they have tooling for that they developed in-house. So to get their contractors and internal people up to speed, they had to create a program, pretty intense and immersive program. And in the old days, pre-pandemic, that was all in person. So basically, you would come to Netflix, you would learn the ropes, and then you would off you go. Post-pandemic, they figured, well, we're Netflix, we're just going to move everything to videos, and so they did. And what they noticed very quickly is that they started losing what they call the human touch. So suddenly, that experience became impersonal. Netflix being Netflix, they care about culture a lot. So they were not very happy with that. So what they chose to do is to swing the pendulum back from self-paced videos to a combination of self-paced and in-person. And for this particular purpose, they leaned into office hours. They created a program called Ask Me Anything. So in other words, you would be learning self-paced, but then you would come to office hours where you would actually get to meet the team behind the curtains, get to interact with them, get to compare the notes, and learn that way. So that's what Netflix did, and that worked for them in retrospect. That was a lesson learned, not to kind of over-index for self-paced learning. We mentioned LinkedIn before in the context of onboarding. This is a different story. They noticed that at LinkedIn, even though people got onboarded, once they started working on projects, there were just too many options for them, too many engineers with too many options. And I observed something similar at Twitter. So for example, if I'm spinning up a new project, I have multiple homegrown databases to choose from. I have, this and that and that and that. And the challenge was having the context of what to choose. The challenge wasn't the documentation, right? Like we had individual documentation, but I couldn't compare, Manhattan to SQL, for example. There are two different flavors. And what was missing was that high level, when do you pick what? So that context, right? And so what LinkedIn did, and what we did also at Twitter, was create a culture of knowledge sharing where people can compare notes by going to workshops and hearing from the teams behind the tools that actually created those tools. So with that, we're going to move to the next tool in the toolbox, or the next set of practices for technical enablement, and that's the documentation. So often I hear from a small company, oh, we don't have this problem, we're just going to document things and everything's going to be magical. Well, the challenge is that that's not necessarily the case. Initially, the documentation may do the trick. However, what we noticed is that very quickly documentation becomes too out of date, and there becomes too much of that. At Twitter, for example, we had at the time the world's largest Confluence installation. We had a couple of 100,000 pages across a few hundred spaces. And the challenge wasn't that I wasn't finding things. I was finding too many things that were contradicting one another. So that was the problem of documentation down the line. It was maintainability and discovery. So at Technocon, we hosted a panel with companies that we consider do this well. So LinkedIn, Uber, Spotify, Spunk showed up, and we discussed documentation. We discussed things like how do you measure drift of documentation? How do you maintain ownership? What about when people leave? How do you normalize things, et cetera, democratize it, and kind of push responsibility to the edges as opposed to own it as a small team. And so this is their story of how they do it. So again, I'll be sharing this afterwards as well. And finally, one of the tools that I also wanted to acknowledge is mentorship and coaching. So more ad hoc in nature, more based on just in time. So I'm doing something, I'm stuck, I need to be unstuck. So it's very personalized. Like I said, it's usually one-on-one or in small group, and it's ad hoc. In other words, there's no prescribed agenda. It's whatever I bring to the table to my mentee, to my mentor, or to my coach. So let's look at a couple of examples, because mentorship, coaching, those things mean different things to different people. We define them as the buddy system, career mentors, professional coaching, and office hours. So I'll give you a few examples of this. So Airbnb, when we started working with them, they did a lot of collaborative learning, and that worked great. And then they said, hey, this is successful. We would like to experiment with peer mentorship as well. In other words, we want to democratize mentorship so that anyone at Airbnb can become a mentor. And so they created a program where they would train their people to become mentors. So in other words, if I wanted to be a mentor, I would take a 4-hour workshop and I would be essentially approved as a mentor. And then I could open up my sessions and people would discover me, and I would build those relationships as a mentor. And so they did that, and Brian Chesky went on stage and encouraged people to do it. And within the first year, they had 10% of employees become mentors, and they ran hundreds of sessions internally. And so they considered it a success and shared their story at inaugural Technocon in 2018. So this article is about that. Shopify, on the other side, tried things differently. So Toby, their CEO, had a personal executive coach, and he really enjoyed that experience. And he basically thought, you know what, I'm going to bring executive coaching to my executive staff. And so that worked. And then they had this insight, well, what if we enable coaching for all at Shopify? And so they hired, and this is the key differentiation, they hired a team of full-time coaches. They had about a dozen full-time coaches. And these coaches basically were there to support anyone at Shopify. So at the time it was 4,000 employees. Now it's about double that. So they created something called Coach's Corner, and that was how they approached this. So slightly different than Airbnb, but also at scale. And I mentioned that I was going to mention Autodesk, and this is a story of creating forums. And Kristen, correct me if I get anything wrong, but the goal was to enable newly minted engineering managers to not just have that codified knowledge, but to also be able to ongoingly compare notes and learn from one another in a small setting, usually confidential and intimate, with a moderator, so somebody who might have had more experience. And so this is I call this forum. I've been a part of something similar externally with 8 CEOs for about 15 years. And so we do something very, very similar in nature. So the goal is to learn from one another in a safe and intimate setting. So again, a form of a small group ad hoc learning. And not to forget, finally, also external expertise. So far, we've been talking mostly about the knowledge that lives within the building, so very internal to a company. And usually that is the biggest problem, because things external to company there's a lot of resources for that. Sometimes it makes sense to bring external expertise in-house as well. So I'll use 2 examples here. And they're at 2 extremes of scale. So Salesforce is huge. They have something like 18,000+ engineers, and they're fairly stable. So their tech stack is well known, and they've been around for a while, so they can afford to do this. And what they do is essentially bring vendors in to teach classes on all aspects of their stack. So it's very technical in nature, and it's powered by professional instructors that come from outside of Salesforce to teach classes. They appear as internal resources and are readily available to anyone, so there's no friction. So any engineer can just sign up for that Python class or the Java class. And so that's kind of how they do it. And they run hundreds of these sessions each quarter for tens of thousands of engineers. So talk about scale. And then we have smaller companies. One of them that we worked with was Essence. So Essence started as a 40-engineer e-commerce shop in Montreal, Canada. And they wanted to become a tech-enabled e-tailer. And so basically transform the business to be a technology business from just a retail business. So they invested a lot into their engineering team that is now 4 or 5 times the size. And one of the things that they did is they basically said, well, if you work here, you can go to any conference, but the catch is once you come back from the conference, you have to also present that knowledge and share it internally. And being in Montreal, they also wanted to create a local brand that in Montreal, this is the best way to work as an engineer. And so they came back a couple of years later and shared the success, and it's been tremendous what they've accomplished with that program. So talking about success and measuring, so how do we do that? And this is sort of the finale of the presentation, and it always comes up. How do you measure, and what are your metrics? So one of the things that we've seen is that there are some known metrics for measuring learning. Kirkpatrick is one. Leadership doesn't usually understand that, so they usually listen to stories that they hear from people. There are some specific metrics when it comes to things like onboarding, like how quickly you get to that first commit or 10th commit or whatever that is. And there's some other a little trickier metrics like culture attrition and what's your recruiting brand out there in the wild, how easy is it to attract talent and so on. So I'll just share 2 stories here. One is Microsoft. Microsoft being huge and having a lot of data, they share what they do. And they did a lot of research on this. What are the barriers? And they basically came up with three things: time, resources, and manager. So an employee must have time allowed, permitted, easy to take for learning. So it needs to be okay so it's not 120% of the work, but it's 20% of the work is learning. They must have resources. So where do they learn from? Is it internal or external? Are there workshops and classes, tech talks, etc., available internally? And third is their manager must encourage them and enable them to learn. So in other words, it's totally okay culturally to do that. And it's across the entire company, not from a manager to a manager. So this is their finding Microsoft did. And I'll wrap up with LinkedIn. This is Rajan. He ran Houston LinkedIn Engineering Bootcamp and was also one of the co-founders in Technocon community that I mentioned. And so his passion is measuring metrics for when it comes to learning, and he focused on Kirkpatrick. So what he discovered is that level 1, where you basically just rate the class, was it, good, great, and so on. That was relatively easy. We call that the smiley sheets. You kind of like just have people fill it out, but it doesn't really mean much. It just means that they might have enjoyed the experience. It doesn't really tell you the result of that. Level 2 is, did you learn what you needed to learn? Sometimes companies in e-learning space do that with quizzes or assessments. What Rajan's team did is they focused on their demo days. So LinkedIn would host demo days. And so if you got to learn something, you also got to build something, and you then got to demo that something. So that was kind of how you demonstrated that you're actually capable of doing it. Level 3 is, did you apply what you learned to your work? And this is a trick. Level 3 and 4 are trickiest and most important to measure. So what they did for level 3, and so did we at Twitter, was essentially ask the question sometime later. So usually 30 to 60 days out, and say, hey, we noticed you took such and such workshop. How is that going? Are you applying that to work? And so that would give us some feedback that was normalized across all the workshops. And level 4 was, what's the impact of you doing that to your work? And what we would do is we would email their managers 90 days out, 60 to 90 days out, and ask the similar question. We noticed that one of your directs completed such and such program. What's the impact of them doing that to your work? So that's kind of how we did that there. So that's just a story on measuring metrics. And with that, I just want to close with some trends that we're seeing. So in the industry, we're seeing companies move from learning for the sake of learning to enablement. And one of the great stories was from late last year. We had Peloton share how they transformed their technical learning team, part of engineering, to technical enablement team. And essentially made a case that it's not about learning, it's about enabling engineers to do their best work. And that got so much resonance with their leadership that the VP of engineering ended up doubling down on their team, so investing more in their team. And all this happened as Peloton was slashing staff post-pandemic, and basically a lot of people are losing their work. So in other words, learning was optional, but enablement is strategic. And so that was one of the key insights from that. So with that, I wanted to open it up for any questions, comments, anything else that comes up that you would like to ask. So now's your time. Questions, comments, concerns, please share. Anybody? You can speak up if we have a small group, or you can type in the chat anything that you would like to ask or know. And if there are no questions, Again, I will follow up with you. You will get an email with the link to the deck. And in the deck, you'll have the links to all the articles. And by the way, all these articles are on Plus Plus site as well under Ideas blog, so you can discover them there. Whenever we host a technical session, we then transcribe it and make it available. So, for example, I mentioned, COVID, carbon health. So that's there as well. Cool, awesome. So with that, thank you very much. It was always great to see people learning more about how to do this, and look out for that email.